when a decorated soldier vanishes from a secure military hospital in the middle of the night. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? An escape attempt? A cry for help? Or something far darker? Now, imagine this: alarms echoing down, sterile hallways, red emergency lights flashing against white walls, nurses rushing past with urgent footsteps, and somewhere in the chaos, a man who had already survived the impossible, disappearing into the unknown. Have you ever been through a moment where you just knew something was about to change forever? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This isn't just another story about a soldier. This is about Captain Michael Harris, a name once celebrated in the United States Army for his bravery in Afghanistan. Now whispered among the staff of St. Andrews Military Medical Center in Virginia for an entirely different reason. Michael had been through Hell 2 tours in a war zone, injuries that would have broken most men, and memories that refused to fade. His body was healing, but his spirit, that was another battle altogether. The hospital where he stayed wasn't just a place for stitches and surgeries. It was a fortress, a controlled environment meant to protect those inside from the outside world, and sometimes to protect them from themselves. Every door was locked, every movement monitored. Yet somehow, in the early hours of a cold November morning, Michael walked out. No one saw him leave, and no one knew where he was going. The doctors knew his file by heart: severe shrapnel wounds, chronic pain, nightmares that ripped him awake in the middle of the night. They'd worked for months to bring him back from the edge, both physically and mentally. So why would a man fighting for his life suddenly vanish without a trace? Here's where the story gets complicated. Michael wasn't the type to run away. He wasn't reckless, and he certainly wasn't trying to avoid treatment. In fact, just the day before, he'd sat with his physical therapist and said he was determined to walk without assistance again. But something had shifted, a sudden urgency in his eyes, a weight in his voice when he asked about visiting hours. Some of the staff thought maybe it was PTSD driving him, flashbacks, confusion, or fear. Others whispered about a letter he'd received earlier that week, one he never let anyone read. But none of them could have predicted the truth. I want you to picture this: a man with fresh stitches on his side, every step sending pain shooting through his body, slipping quietly out of a hospital where cameras watch every corner. Not because he wanted to escape treatment, but because something or someone was waiting for him out there, something that mattered more to him than his own safety. Have you ever felt that pull? That undeniable force that tells you no matter the risk, you have to go. That's the kind of urgency that pushed Michael past the locked doors and into the night. And while the military police scrambled and the nurses' station lit up with calls, Michael was already miles away, chasing a mission no one had authorized. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change his life, it shook the very people trained to handle the unshakable. Even the doctors who had seen the worst of war found themselves fighting back tears when they learned why he left. And the reason is something I'm about to tell you. But first, you need to understand the moment that set all of this in motion. It's in moments like this that I realize how powerful these stories truly are, not just for the people who lived them, but for everyone who hears them. Because maybe you've never been in a military hospital at 2 in the morning. Alarms blaring, your heart pounding with uncertainty. But you've felt that same urgency, that same pull toward something that mattered more than anything else. And that's why I want to hear from you. If this topic resonates with you, if it stirs something inside you, whether it's a memory, an opinion, or just a feeling you can't quite put into words, leave your thoughts in the comments below. You'd be surprised how many people might connect with your perspective. And sometimes the right words at the right moment can make someone out there feel less alone. When you take a second to comment, to click that like button, or to subscribe, You're not just helping this channel grow, you're helping keep these stories alive. You're making it possible for more people to hear about the moments of courage, love, and sacrifice that might otherwise be forgotten. Your participation is what turns this from just another video into a community of people who care, who understand, who believe these voices deserve to be heard. So, if you believe these stories matter, I think you do take that moment now. Like this video so it can reach more eyes. Subscribe if you want to walk with me through more journeys like Michael's, and add your voice in the comments, because every time you engage, you're not just supporting me, you're helping carry these messages to someone who might need them more than you realize. Now, back to that night, the moment Michael stepped beyond those gates, his breath hanging in the cold air, his body aching, but his mind locked on a single goal. Something was already set in motion that no one in that hospital could have stopped. Chapter 1. The mystery. Michael Harris wasn't just another name on a chart or a soldier passing through the system. He had been a captain in the United States Army, a man whose leadership had earned him the trust of his unit and the respect of his superiors. He was the kind of officer who didn't just give orders from a safe distance, he was on the front lines with his men, sharing the same dust, the same cold nights, the same risks. His service had taken him to Afghanistan twice, and both times he'd returned carrying more than just the visible wounds. There were scars on his body, jagged reminders of shrapnel and gunfire, but there were also those deeper marks no X-ray could reveal. The last time he came home, it wasn't on his own 2 feet. The medics had carried him off the transport plane, his uniform torn, his breathing shallow, his face pale. That day, the battlefield had followed him back to U.S. soil, settling inside him in ways no one could see. The military hospital became his new base, his new battleground. Here, the weapons were 4 lines and painkillers. The strategies were rehabilitation plans, and the enemy was a mixture of chronic pain, nightmares, and the quiet ache of remembering what was lost. St. Andrews Military Medical Center was known for its discipline as much as its care. The security was tight, not because the patients were prisoners, but because many of them were in fragile states, both physically and mentally. Some needed protection from the outside world, others from themselves. The staff knew every patient's routine, every therapy session, every scheduled visitor. And yet, somehow, in the early hours of that November morning, Michael slipped through that carefully guarded structure without triggering the systems meant to prevent exactly that. What made it strange was that Michael wasn't the type to push against rules without reason. In fact, the nurses often said he was one of the most cooperative patients in the ward. He followed instructions, respected schedules, and even encouraged others to keep up with their treatments. His escape or disappearance, as some preferred to call it, wasn't the act of someone rebelling against authority. It wasn't about running away from pain or from the discipline of recovery. There was something else at play, something quieter and far more deliberate. I've spoken to people who were there that night. Can their accounts all carry the same subtle detail? Michael had seemed different in the days before he left. Not restless in the way some patients get, but focused, almost like a man preparing for a mission. He asked questions that didn't seem to matter at the time. The visiting hours for civilians, the fastest route to the main entrance, whether the security cameras in the East Wing were operational. They sounded harmless in the moment, the kind of curiosity you don't think twice about. But now, looking back, they feel like the breadcrumbs of a plan. He was quietly piecing together. He had been receiving letters, handwritten ones, from an address no one recognized. Sometimes he would read them right away. Other times, he'd tuck them under his pillow, unopened, as if he needed to be in the right frame of mind before facing the words inside. No one knew what they said, but each letter seemed to stir something in him. A nurse told me she saw him once, sitting by the window after reading one, his hand resting on the folded page, his eyes fixed far beyond the hospital gates. That's the part that makes this story so compelling. This wasn't a man acting on impulse. This was someone who had endured chaos and understood the weight of every decision. Whatever drew him out of that hospital, it wasn't a whim, it was a mission. One with a personal significance that outweighed his own safety. He didn't walk away from treatment because he gave up. He walked toward something because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. And that's where the mystery deepens. The military police were quick to assume he was confused or in distress, maybe even a danger to himself. But those who knew him better hesitated to jump to conclusions. They recognized that look in his eyes. The set of his joint was the same look he had before leading his unit into dangerous terrain. A look that said he had already decided, long before anyone else realized a decision needed to be made. There's something powerful about that kind of determination. It forces you to think about the choices we all face in moments that define us. The crossroads where comfort and safety are on one side and on the other. The unknown path that calls to something deeper inside us. For Michael, the risk of staying outweighed the risk of leaving. That's not the kind of calculation you make without reason. And whatever his reason was, it was worth every ounce of pain his body would endure once he stepped beyond those gates. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic. Because understanding who Michael was and the mindset he carried means looking beyond the surface of a soldier's recovery. It means stepping into the private world behind the medical charts, where resilience isn't about medals or public ceremonies, but about the quiet decisions made when no one is watching. It means asking what could compel a man to trade the safety of his hospital bed for the uncertainty of the outside world, knowing full well that his body wasn't ready for the journey. And maybe that's where this story begins to connect with all of us, because we've all faced moments, whether in war or in everyday life, when we've had to choose between staying where it's safe and stepping into something uncertain but necessary. Those moments reveal the hidden truths about who we are and what we're willing to fight for. Comment here. This makes sense to me if you understand exactly what I. Chapter 2. The Soldier's Trauma. Michael's story can't be understood without stepping back into the war that shaped him. Afghanistan wasn't just a place on a map for him, it was a relentless test of endurance, leadership, and survival. He first deployed in 2010, a time when the conflict was shifting. Strategies were changing, and the line between safety and danger was often no more than a thin wall or the length of a dusty road. He led his platoon through heat that burned the skin, nights so cold they made bones ache, and patrols where every sound a loose stone, the wind through metal. Be the start of an ambush. On his second tour, Michael carried more than his weapon and gear. He carried the memories of men he couldn't bring home, the weight of decisions that haunted him when the world went quiet. Combat changes you in ways no training manual prepares you for. It sharpens instincts, yes, but it also etches invisible scars into the mind. The day that nearly ended his life came in a remote village, far from any base, where intelligence suggested insurgents were using abandoned houses for storage. His unit moved in carefully, clearing one building after another until the explosion ripped through the narrow alley. The force threw him against a wall, shrapnel tearing through muscle and lodging deep near his ribs. The blast left him gasping, ears ringing, his vision blurred by smoke and dust. Even after the medics dragged him to safety, the pain wasn't just in his body, it was in the realization that 2 of his men hadn't made it out. That loss would stay with him long after the wounds began to close. The physical toll was severe. Multiple surgeries to remove fragments, a metal plate to stabilize his side, and nerve damage that left him with a constant burning ache. Walking even a short distance required effort, each step sending sharp reminders of what had happened. Sleep was no refuge. His nights were filled with jolting awake to the echo of blasts, the phantom scent of burning metal, the gut punch memory of calling out names into the dark and getting no answer. Back home, the battlefield followed him in ways others couldn't see. The sound of fireworks on the 4th of July sent his pulse racing. A sudden movement in his peripheral vision could make him flinch. Crowded spaces felt like traps. Silence felt like waiting for something to happen. These weren't weaknesses, they were the mind's way of staying ready, long after the danger had passed. But in a world that wasn't at war, they became exhausting. Scene. Andrews became the place where he tried to rebuild. But recovery wasn't just about healing muscles and regaining movement. It was about learning how to live in a world that moved at a different pace, where decisions didn't carry life or death consequences every hour. His physical therapy sessions were grueling, bending, stretching, forcing his body past limits. It resisted. The doctors adjusted his medications carefully, balancing pain relief with the need to keep him alert. What many people don't realize is that military hospitals are also emotional crossroads. You meet people who have been through the same kind of hell, and you share a bond that's both comforting and devastating. You hear stories that mirror your own, and some that make your own seem almost bearable. You see triumphs, someone taking their first steps again, and heartbreaks, someone giving up before they can. For Michael, those walls held both inspiration and reminders of what he had lost. And then there were the nights when the halls went quiet except for the distant hum of machines. That's when the mind fills the silence with echoes of the past. He told one nurse once, in a rare moment of openness, that the hardest part wasn't the pain, it was the feeling that he had left something unfinished overseas. That there was a loose thread pulling at him, something he couldn't ignore no matter how much he wanted to focus on recovery. That thought became a seed, and over time, it grew into something that kept him awake longer than the pain ever did. His mindset began to shift. What had once been about healing and adapting started to take on a sharper edge, as though he was preparing for another mission. Not a mission in the military sense. There were no orders, no superiors, no official objectives, but something personal, something tied to that unfinished business he couldn't name to anyone. And this is where the hidden truth about trauma comes in. It doesn't always pull you backward. Sometimes it pushes you forward into decisions others can't understand because they're not carrying the same weight. The transformation isn't about erasing the past, but about deciding how to live with it, and sometimes that means stepping into a path no one else sees. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic. Because the real impact of war isn't just written in medical reports or service records, it's in the quiet choices, the private battles, the moments of resolve that shape the rest of a person's journey. Understanding what drove Michael means tracing that invisible line from the streets of Afghanistan to the cold corridors of St. Andrews, and following it beyond the hospital gates into a world where his next step would change everything. Right? Here, I'm on this journey too. If you know exactly what that kind of pull feels like. Chapter 3. The Military Hospital Environment Test. Andrews Military Medical Center was a place that lived in two realities at once. On the surface, it was a sanctuary, state-of-art equipment, skilled doctors, dedicated nurses, and an unspoken promise to do everything possible to rebuild the lives of the men and women who passed through its doors. But beneath that promise was another truth, one that everyone inside could feel, even if no one wanted to talk about it. It wasn't just a hospital, it was a holding ground between two worlds, the battlefield and civilian life. And for many, it felt like being caught in limbo. The air inside always carried a faint mix of antiseptic and brewed coffee, a smell that clung to your clothes long after you left. In the daytime, the corridors were busy, orderlies pushing wheelchairs, therapists guiding patients through slow, careful steps, doctors leaning over charts in hushed but urgent conversations. From the outside, it might have looked like a place in constant motion, progress happening everywhere. But if you stayed long enough, you noticed the rhythm wasn't always forward. Some days, it was just a cycle: pain management, therapy, medication. Rest repeated again and again. Like time was looping instead of moving. Michael's room was on the east wing, where sunlight spilled in during the mornings and lingered until late afternoon. That light was both a blessing and a reminder. It warmed the space, yes, but it also threw long shadows across the floor, stretching toward the bed like they were trying to pull him somewhere else. He'd watch them sometimes, his eyes following the shapes as if the shadows carried answers. He couldn't quite read. The ward was filled with people like him, some younger, some older, each with their own story stitched into their skin. In the next room, there was a young Marine who had lost both legs to an IED. Across the hall, a medic who had carried half her unit to safety was learning how to hold a spoon again. Conversations in the common areas were a strange blend of dark humor, shared frustration, and quiet encouragement. Laughter could erupt one moment, followed by a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. For the staff, it was a constant balancing act. They weren't just treating injuries, they were navigating emotions, tempers, and memories that didn't stay neatly locked away. A physical therapist might push a patient harder one day, then back off the next because they could see that the fight in their eyes wasn't about the exercise, it was about something deeper gnawing at them. The doctors had to be more than medical experts. They had to be interpreters of unspoken pain, reading between the lines of what their patients wouldn't or couldn't say. At night, the hospital felt different. The buzz of daytime activity faded, replaced by the soft beeping of monitors and the distant hum of ventilation. That's when the atmosphere shifted. Without the distraction of appointments or group therapy, the walls seemed to absorb every unspoken thought, every restless memory. It was in these hours that Michael felt the pull of the outside world the strongest. Not because he wanted to escape the care he was receiving, but because the silence made it harder to ignore the unfinished business waiting for him somewhere beyond those gates. The structure of St. Andrews made leaving without clearance nearly impossible. Security cameras covered the hallways. The entrances required coded keycards, and the outer gates were patrolled regularly. These measures were there to keep everyone safe, patients, staff, and visitors alike. But to someone with Michael's background, who had navigated far more dangerous terrain, obstacles were just problems waiting for solutions. And lately, he had started to notice the small details: which guards switched posts at what times, which cameras had a slightly wider blind spot, how often the doors to the supply rooms were left unlocked. It wasn't that he was planning anything yet, but his mind had begun working in the way it used to on deployment, constantly scanning, evaluating, preparing, and maybe that's what made the hospital environment so complex. It was meant to protect, but it also confined, nurtured, but it also reminded you daily of what had been taken from you. For some patients, those walls were safety. For others, they were a constant reminder that life outside had moved on without them. Michael existed in the middle ground, accepting the care he needed while quietly acknowledging that he wouldn't be here forever. Not because of a discharge date or a medical clearance, but because something far beyond those corridors was pulling at him, stronger than any injury holding him back. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what happened in that controlled, carefully monitored environment wasn't just about recovery, was about the slow build of a decision. The way a person can appear to be following every rule while quietly preparing for a moment that will change everything. It's in the small details, the unnoticed habits, the subtle shifts in mindset that hint at a larger truth waiting to surface. Comment here. I can feel the weight of this if you understand exactly what kind of tension I'm talking about. Chapter 4. The day of the escape. It began like any other night, quiet in the way only a military hospital could be. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, where every sound carries farther than it should. Earlier in the evening, Michael had gone through his usual routine dinner at 6 p.m. A brief session with his physical therapist at 7:30, then back to his room where he spent almost an hour reading by the window. From the outside, nothing about that night seemed unusual, but there was a subtle difference in the way he moved. The way his eyes lingered on the hallway whenever a nurse passed by. By 9 p.m., the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm. The common areas were empty, the televisions in the lounges switched off, and the corridors dimly lit to encourage rest. The nurses made their last medication rounds before midnight, checking on each patient, updating charts, adjusting blankets. When they reached Michael's room, he was lying in bed, awake but calm, and he thanked them for coming by. Nothing about him suggested what was coming. Around 1 a.m., the East Wing grew even quieter. Security officers did their routine walkthrough, scanning doors and noting nothing out of place. The night shift at St. Andrews was predictable, almost comforting in its regularity. But that predictability also meant that anyone who paid close enough attention could see the patterns at times when hallways were empty, when the fewest eyes were on the cameras, when footsteps echoed from farther away than usual. At 2:17 a.m., Michael got out of bed. Not quickly, not with the urgency of someone fleeing danger, but with a slow, deliberate movement, like he'd done this 100 times before in his head. He dressed in civilian clothes he had folded neatly in a drawer, clothes no one had seen him wear since his admission. Each motion was careful, calculated, as if even the sound of fabric could give him away. By 2:45 a.m., he was in the hallway. The cameras captured a lone figure walking with measured steps, head slightly lowered, hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't run, didn't dart into shadows. He simply moved as though he belonged there, as though he had a reason to be exactly where he was. That confidence, more than anything, was what kept him from drawing attention. The nurses on duty later said they hadn't heard a thing. No unusual noises, no doors opening or closing. And yet, at 3:08 a.m., Michael was spotted on a camera farther down the east corridor, moving toward a service exit rarely used at night. This door was secured with a keypad, one that staff assumed patients couldn't access. But at 3:11 a.m., the feed showed the lock disengaging, the door opening just enough for him to slip through, and then closing quietly behind him. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that bites through layers. The hospital grounds were lit by tall lampposts casting pale circles on the pavement. Michael stayed just outside their reach, following a path that skirted the edge of the property. At 3:19 a.m., the last camera caught him a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the street beyond the gates. After that, there was nothing. The alarm didn't go off right away. It wasn't until 4:32 a.m., during a routine head count, that a nurse realized Michael's bed was empty. The sheets were smooth, the pillow barely disturbed. It was as though he had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. That's when the calls started. The internal security line, the military police, the shift supervisor. 4:50 a.m., officers were combing the grounds, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their breath visible in the cold. The tension was immediate and palpable. For the staff who had treated him, worry mixed with disbelief. They knew his condition, knew the pain he lived with every day, and couldn't fathom why he would risk worsening it. For the military police, it became a matter of urgency and unaccounted for. Soldier outside the safety of the facility was a problem they couldn't afford. And for the few patients who learned of it before the rumors were shut down, it was a strange mix of fear and admiration. Fear, because they knew the world outside could be unforgiving. Admiration, because leaving like that took a kind of resolve. They understood all too well. As the sun began to rise, the search expanded beyond the hospital gates. Patrol cars swept through nearby streets, and officers questioned anyone who might have been out during those early hours. But Michael seemed. to have disappeared completely, leaving no obvious trail, no sign of where he was headed. Every lead fizzled into another question, and the unspoken thought hung in the air. He didn't just wander off, he had somewhere to be. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic. Because the true intrigue isn't just in how Michael left, but in the quiet, meticulous way he set the stage for a tall way that speaks to the mindset of someone who has lived through situations where timing and precision were the difference between success and disaster. Understanding those final hours inside St. Andrews might be the key to uncovering the hidden truth about where he went next, and why. Right here. I can picture this clearly if the scene already plays out in your mind. Chapter 5. The Search. And panic the moment the absence was confirmed. The air inside St. Andrews shifted from calm to electric. It wasn't the kind of chaos you see in movies, no shouting. No running down hallways, but a sudden tightening. It's a quiet urgency that spread from one staff member to another like a silent alarm. Nurses began moving faster, their voices low, but clipped. Clipboards appeared in hands, doors opened and closed in quick succession. And the hum of the hospital turned into an undercurrent of tension. The first call went to the on-site security team, then to the military police. They were on the grounds within minutes, their boots striking against the tiled floors as they moved through the East Wing, scanning every corner, checking supply rooms. Even the small outdoor smoking area near the back of the building. Patients who were awake peeked out of their rooms, eyes following the sudden influx of uniforms, whispering to one another, trying to guess who had gone missing and why. For those who knew Michael, the worry came fast. They'd seen the pain he carried, how slow and deliberate his steps were during therapy, how he gripped the railings in the hallway when the aches in his side flared up. A man in that condition couldn't simply vanish into the night without help, and yet the cameras showed no accomplice, no one walking with him. It was almost harder to believe that he had done it alone than to think someone had smuggled him out. By 5:15 a.m., search teams had split into zones. Some combed the hospital grounds, flashing lights into the dark spaces between maintenance sheds and checking every vehicle in the staff parking lot. Others took to the surrounding streets, alerting local law enforcement and pulling up any available traffic camera footage. Every minute that passed without a lead felt heavier. The longer he was out there, the greater the risk, not just from whatever physical strain his body was under, but from the unknown reasons that had driven him to leave in the first place. Inside, the tension was palpable. One nurse stood by the main desk with her arms crossed, her jaw tight, watching the doors as if she expected him to walk back in at any moment. Another muttered under her breath about how this had never happened before, not like this. Patients left in the common area stared at the muted TV, their minds clearly elsewhere. They knew what it meant for someone to leave without clearance. It wasn't just breaking a rule. It was stepping outside the safety net into a world that could be merciless. The military police began piecing together a timeline from the security footage. They noted the moment he stepped into the hallway, the brief glimpses of him in the east corridor, the exact second the service door clicked open. The way he moved struck them no hesitation, no frantic glances over his shoulder, no wasted motion. This wasn't the behavior of someone running blindly, it was the execution of a plan, and that unsettled them more than if he had bolted in a panic back at the hospital. The doctors couldn't help but run through the possibilities. Physically, Michael wasn't ready for extended travel. His injuries, even healing as well as they were, would have made long distances punishing. And yet, he had walked out under his own strength and kept going. That alone was a feat, one that spoke less to physical capability and more to sheer willpower. They understood the mindset of soldiers, how training can push a person far beyond their limits, but it still baffled them that he could vanish so completely. The search expanded outward. By sunrise, patrol cars were checking gas stations, diners, and the small 24-hour convenience stores scattered across the nearby neighborhoods. Officers asked about a man matching his description: tall, lean build, walking with a slight stiffness. In his stride, but most responses were vague. One store clerk thought she'd seen someone similar just before dawn, but she couldn't be sure. Another mentioned a man in a dark jacket heading toward the old industrial district, but the details were thin and the trail already felt cold. What unsettled the search teams the most was the lack of any sign of distress. No discarded items, no calls for help, no witnesses who saw him struggling. He had slipped through their net as though he'd known exactly where to go to avoid drawing attention. For the military police, this wasn't just about finding him. Anymore, it was about understanding how someone in his state could outmaneuver the layers of security meant to keep him safe. Inside St. Andrews, the whispers continued. Some patients saw him as reckless, endangering himself when he still had a long road to recovery. Others looked at him with a quiet kind of respect, recognizing the resolve it must have taken to walk out those doors. But whether they judged or admired him, everyone agreed on one thing: it was deeply unusual. Patients didn't just disappear. And when they did, it was never without a trail. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the way Michael moved through those hours, the choices he made without anyone noticing, speaks to something beyond physical ability. It's about the discipline of the mind, the ability to focus on a goal so completely that every step, every decision aligns with reaching it. To understand what drove him to risk everything that night, we have to look not just at the man who left, but at the path he chose to take once he was beyond the gates. Comment here. I can feel the urgency if you can already sense the weight of what was unfolding. Chapter 6. The unexpected reason revealed the truth about Jake's disappearance didn't come from a police report or a dramatic arrest. It surfaced quietly, almost reluctantly, through fragments of conversations and the slow piecing together of details by those who knew him best. At first, the military police had nothing solid, just the certainty that this was no accident. But then, one nurse remembered something small, something she had brushed aside at the time. 3 days before he left, Michael had asked if there was any way to leave the hospital for a few hours to visit someone in hospice care. She told him it wasn't possible, not without clearance, and certainly not in his condition. He didn't argue, just gave a short nod and let the subject drop, or so she thought. When his absence hit the news among veterans groups, a message came in from a woman living 2 towns over. She was the sister of a soldier who had served under Michael during his second deployment. That soldier, Corporal James Nolan, hadn't come home. Michael had written to the family after the funeral, promising them that he would check in on them whenever he could. But years passed, and the visits were rare. Life and recovery kept pulling him in other directions. What the woman shared next made everything click into place. Her father, James's dad, was dying. The doctors had given him days, maybe less. And according to her, Michael had called her earlier that week, his voice steady but weighted, asking if he could see the man one last time. It wasn't about closure for himself. It was about keeping a promise. He had told James's father, back at the funeral, that he'd always look out for the family. And now, faced with the reality that the man might not see another sunrise, Michael couldn't stand the thought of that promise ending as just words spoken years ago. He had to make it real. That explained everything: the quiet preparation, the measured steps, the timing. He wasn't running from something. He was running to someone. It was the kind of decision that, to most, might seem reckless. But for Michael, it was simple math. The pain, the risk of reopening wounds, the possibility of being caught before he arrived, none of it outweighed the need to be there. To sit by that man's side and say the things that couldn't wait any longer. Picture it, the dimly lit room. In the hospice, the faint hum of machines, the air thick with that fragile stillness that only exists when the end is near. Michael walking in leaner than when they'd last met, moving slower, but still carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a soldier. The old man looking up, recognition sparking through the haze, his hand lifting weakly from the bed. In that moment, all the noise from the outside world, the alarms, the search teams, the rules faded. It was just two people bound by the life of someone they both had loved and lost. No cameras captured what was said in that room. No reports detailed the exact exchange, but those who heard about it from the family described it in fragments. A hand held tightly, a voice cracking mid-sentence, a long silence where words weren't needed. Michael stayed for less than an hour, but in that short time, he gave the man something beyond comfort. He gave him the reassurance that his son's memory lived on in the people who had fought beside him. When Michael left the hospice, the dawn was breaking. He didn't linger, didn't wait for thanks. His mission was complete, and that was enough. It wasn't about being seen, it was about doing the thing that had to be done, even if no one else understood the urgency. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because moments like this reveal the real architecture of a person's mindset. They show us the hidden truth behind decisions that, on the surface, look impulsive, but in reality are the result of years of carrying an unspoken obligation. This wasn't just about honoring a fallen comrade, it was about transformation. About the way a single promise can anchor a person's choices long after the battlefield is gone. And in Michael's case, it was about how that sense of duty didn't fade when the war ended, simply changed shape. Right here, I understand why he had to go, if this reason makes perfect sense to you. Chapter 7. The doctor's emotional response when the truth finally reached the medical staff at St. Andrews. It didn't arrive with fanfare or in an official report. It came quietly, like a whispered explanation passed from one person to another in the break room, each retelling softening the earlier frustration and replacing it with something more complex. For hours, the narrative had been about a patient breaking protocol, a soldier risking his recovery, a breach of trust in a place where trust was essential. But once they learned why he had gone, that story shifted. One of the nurses who had been visibly tense during the search was the first to speak what many were feeling. She leaned against the counter, eyes distant, and said, "If it had been my father, I would have done the same." That single sentence cut through the layers of procedure and regulation, landing in a place that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with being human. The doctors, too, felt the change. These were people trained to manage emergencies, to handle crises with composure, to measure every decision against standards of care and patient safety. But beneath their white coats, they were sons, daughters, siblings, and parents. They understood that the need to keep a promise, especially one tied to the memory of someone lost, doesn't wait for the right timing or official permission. It demands to be honored in the moment it matters most. For Dr. Patel, who had overseen Michael's recovery since the day he arrived, the revelation hit particularly hard. She had been one of the first to voice concern about his physical state, arguing that any abrupt movement outside the hospital could set him back weeks, maybe months. But when she heard that his absence had been about sitting beside a dying man, about giving a final gift of presence, her voice softened. "Medicine can't always measure the cost of regret," she said later. "We can heal wounds, but we can't heal the weight of a moment missed." Around the nurses' station, the earlier chatter about security breaches gave way to quiet reflection. They began to recall the small signs of the letters, the way Michael had been watching the clock in recent days, the unusual questions about visiting hours. At the time, those details had been background noise. Now, they took on the weight of a man preparing himself not to escape, but to arrive somewhere in time. The staff didn't suddenly excuse the risks he'd taken. Rules existed for a reason, and they couldn't simply ignore them. but understanding his motive made it impossible to see him as reckless or irresponsible. Instead, they saw a man who had weighed his choices, knowing exactly what he was giving up and what he stood to gain. It was the kind of decision that lives in a gray area, the space between professional caution and personal conviction, where the heart has more influence than any handbook. Some of the younger nurses, new to working with veterans, admitted that. This was the first time they truly grasped how military bonds extend beyond service. It wasn't just about the soldiers who stood beside you in battle, it was about the families connected to them, the promises made in moments of grief that quietly become part of your identity. Michael hadn't left to chase freedom or to avoid treatment. He had left because those bonds don't dissolve when the war ends by the end of the day. The frustration that had filled the halls in the early hours had transformed into something quieter, almost reverent. There was a sense of having witnessed a glimpse of the unseen side of their work, not the scheduled appointments or the steady progress charts, but the deeply personal reasons that sometimes lead patients to make choices that defy logic. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because the reaction of those doctors and nurses wasn't just about empathy for Michael. It was a reminder of how the human element exists even in the most structured environments. It was about the hidden truth that sometimes healing isn't confined to a hospital bed, and that the most impactful moments of a person's journey can happen far beyond the walls, where we expect them to. Right here, I get why they felt that way if you understand the shift they went through. Chapter 8. The resilience of humanity. What Michael did that night was more than a physical act of walking out of a hospital. It was a statement about what it means to be human when rules and reality collide. War had already broken parts of his body, had already tested the edges of his endurance. But there was something inside him it couldn't touch. The bond he felt toward the people tied to his service, the ones whose stories were woven into his own. That bond wasn't abstract or symbolic. It was living, breathing, and it demanded action when the moment called for it. You see, resilience isn't just about surviving hardship. It's about holding on to the parts of yourself that hardship tries to erase. For some, that's hope. For others, it's faith. For Michael, it was loyalty, a deep-rooted commitment to promises that most people might not even remember making. War had taught him that time is fragile, that opportunities to make things right don't always come twice. That knowledge became part of his decision-making, shaping his mindset long after he'd left the battlefield in the military. Soldiers learn to act under pressure, to strip away hesitation and focus on what must be done. But what's rarely talked about is how that same training shapes their personal lives after service. It's why someone like Michael could weigh the physical risks of leaving against the emotional cost of staying and decide, without flinching, that the risk was worth it. He knew that missing that goodbye would leave a wound no surgeon could stitch closed. The broader truth here is that love and loyalty have their own kind of urgency. They operate on a clock that isn't always in sync with our daily lives, and when the alarm goes off, you either answer it or live with the echo of having ignored it. For veterans, those alarms can be especially loud because they've lived through moments when a split-second choice determined whether someone lived or died. That kind of awareness doesn't fade, seeps into everything, and that's why stories like Michael's resonate beyond military circles. You don't have to be a soldier to understand the weight of keeping your word, or the ache of not getting to say what you needed to before it was too late. We've all had moments where doing the right thing meant bending, or even breaking, the rules that were meant to guide us. What's rare is the courage to actually follow through when the stakes are high and the cost is personal. In many ways, Michael's act was a reminder that healing isn't only about the body. For him, sitting at that bedside was as much a part of his recovery as the hours he spent in physical therapy. It wasn't about erasing pain. was about making peace with the parts of his story that still had unfinished chapters. There's a hidden truth here. Sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't happen in the moments where we're cared for, but in the moments where we care for someone else. The doctors could treat his wounds, but only Michael could address the quiet guilt and lingering weight of that old promise. And in honoring it, he wasn't just giving something to the dying man, he was reclaiming a part of himself that the war had tried to take. That's the side of resilience we don't talk about enough. It's not always loud, not always visible. Sometimes it's a quiet, unshakable decision made in the middle of the night, when no one else knows what you're carrying. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when you strip away the uniforms, the titles, and the hospital walls, what you're left with is the raw core of why we fight for anything at all connection. Whether on the battlefield or in a quiet hospice room, it's the relationships we forge, the promises we keep, and the love we refuse to let go of that shape the kind of people we become. Right here, I believe in bonds like that. If you know exactly the kind of loyalty I'm talking about. Chapter 9, and now. Sometimes the bravest battles are fought far from the battlefield. They're not marked by gunfire or explosions, but by the quiet, personal moments where the choice to act comes with no applause, no recognition, just the knowledge that you did what your heart demanded. Michael's night wasn't about defiance for its own sake. It wasn't about proving strength or escaping the walls of St. Andrews. It was about answering a call that existed long before the hospital, long before his injury, and even long before that fateful day in Afghanistan. The truth is, courage often looks different than we expect. We imagine it in bold strokes, charging forward, standing tall, making speeches that echo in the air. But in reality, courage is just as often found in the small, deliberate steps a person takes when no one is watching. It's in showing up. Not because it's easy or convenient, but because not showing up would leave a wound you couldn't live with. That's the kind of decision Michael made. And that's the kind of decision that transforms a person not into someone new, but into someone more fully themselves. When I think about his journey, I'm reminded that transformation rarely announces itself. It happens in moments like this, where every excuse to stay put is laid out in front of you, yet you choose the harder path because it matters. Michael didn't walk out of that hospital to make a statement. He walked out because he understood that the measure of a promise isn't in when it's made, but in when it's kept. And keeping it that night meant risking pain, risking setback, risking whatever consequences would follow. There's also a hidden truth in his story that's that's worth sitting with. For many, the war ends when the deployment ends. For soldiers, it's rarely that simple. The bonds they form, the losses they carry, and the promises they make have no expiration date. They live on, shaping choices years after the uniforms are folded away. Michael's act wasn't about nostalgia, it was about continuity. About refusing to let the thread between himself and James's family be cut. Just because time had passed, it's easy to judge decisions from the outside, especially when they seem to disregard the rules or logic we're used to. But if you strip away the layers, you'll often find the kind of values we say we admire: loyalty, compassion, integrity, just playing out in ways that don't fit neatly into a policy manual. That's what makes this story so powerful. It's not just about one soldier and one promise. It's about the universal moments where we each decide whether to live by the ideals we claim to hold. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the question his story leaves us with isn't just, would you have done the same? It's, what promises in your life are worth breaking the rules for? We all have them, whether we admit it or not. And sometimes, the real challenge is recognizing them before the moment to act has passed. If you were in his place, would you have done the same? Comment here. I would have gone too if you know in your heart your answer. If you've stayed with me all the way to this point, then you already know this wasn't just a story about a soldier. It was about the choices we make when our hearts leave us no other option. That's why I'd love for you to stick around here with me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next time we dive into stories that matter, the ones that linger long after the screen goes dark. It all the way to the end, drop a quick comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you were right here with me through it all. Go ahead and tap that like button too, not as a formality, but as a way of saying, yeah, this connected with me. It helps me keep bringing you more of these conversations that dig a little deeper than headlines and surface details. And since you're already here, there's a video waiting right here that ties in beautifully with what we've just explored. Another story of resilience, of hidden truths and unexpected turns. Click it, and let's keep walking through these moments together.